This is a reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verse 9 and on. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. What would you do if God told you to kill your son? What would you do if God told you to drop a nuke on someone? What would you do if God told you to steal? What would you do if God told you to do this thing which seems kind of shady? We literally have here, God says to Abraham a couple verses earlier, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I'll show you. God tells Abraham to do that, to do this thing that seems completely wrong and completely immoral. What does this mean? What does this tell us about the Christian faith? It's very important to understand how important Isaac is to Abraham, that which is explained in the chapters before this in Genesis, and explaining, I guess, Abraham's faith in God. We know that God promises Abraham descendants, like descendants as numerous as the stars. He makes his covenant with Abraham, and he tells him that through him and through his offspring that he'll be blessed, and there'll be like infinite generations. And specifically too, God says through Isaac. Yes, it's chapter 21, verse 12. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that your offspring shall be named. Because Abraham had another kid, Ishmael, through a different woman, not through his wife Sarah. But God's saying specifically Isaac, you'll have offspring. And then God says, go and sacrifice Isaac. Go kill your son as a burnt offering for me. Another last interesting thing about the text is if you look at verse 5, before Abraham's going up to the mountain, he says to the men that were with him, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham already has the command to go sacrifice his son, but he knows he's going to come back, we, plural, with his son. That's just something interesting to think about here. So, after we have this verse a bit more, like, how can we understand Abraham? How can we understand his actions? He is literally called the father of faith, both in Jewish and Christian tradition. He is the first one, I guess, or who God establishes his covenant with. And he's so important. But God tells Abraham to kill his son. Now that's not ethical. In terms of viewing ethics as a broad, I guess, prescription for how to live, we literally have don't murder, or Jesus even goes further, like whoever looks on someone with hate commits murder in his heart. We have these broad ethical guidelines that we're supposed to live by, but yet it seems here that what God is telling Abraham and Abraham's individual mission is above the ethical. Now, this idea is written about wonderfully. I would highly recommend Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. I read it for a philosophy class, which I was so grateful to take, Existentialism, Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And he calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical. Teleological is like purpose or mission-based suspension of the ethical, of like the universal societal norm to not kill your son. And Kierkegaard is putting higher here the teleological, or specifically what God's will is for Abraham. And this is so interesting because it disposes a view of humans, of ethics, of morality that we can't really grasp, or we can't get to. Kierkegaard, again, the book's beautiful, Fear and Trembling. Please read it. It's a little hard to read, but it's beautiful. Kierkegaard emphasizes that we can't understand Abraham. We just can't. None of us, I haven't. I don't have a kid, but I haven't been told to kill my kid. We haven't been given these kind of strange and odd commandments from God, like Abraham. So Abraham stands in a class of his own. And in some degree, though, so do we as Christians. Yes, fellowship. Yes, community. Yes, man shall not live alone. It's not good to live alone and be in solitude, but there is a solitary and individualistic component of Christianity. And a large part of this is this calling from God, which is unique for an individual. And in trying to live out someone else's calling, okay, so we get this idea like, hey, like, yes, ethics are our baseline, but God's calling supersedes ethics. We're not supposed to follow someone else's calling from God. We're supposed to follow our calling. If you start doing that, this comparison, like, oh, like Abraham, he's a great guy, he killed his son, and then you start, binding your son to go sacrifice him as a burnt offering for God, that's not it either. So this kind of can help defeat and calm, I guess, notions of like comparison, like, oh, this person has more muscle, made more money, prettier girlfriend, whatever it is that you may want to compare yourself to. There's a notion of, okay, but what is God calling you and for your life? And one thing too with this is it's very important, again, then to be discriminating. Is this call from God? Or is this from Satan? Is this from an evil spirit? One quick way, or is this from even my mind or something like I'm telling myself God told me? One brief way, again, I'm not like a master on this discernment of spirits by any stretch of the imagination, but we can kind of discern, like, where is this calling from, is how do we feel about it? Like, there's a quote from a saint, I forget who, which is when God speaks, he moves. He moves in our hearts. He moves in our interior dispositions, where when we get this conviction, if it's from God, we'll also like feel it like deeply in our heart. Like, yes, like now that I know that to be true. So that's just one way to discern like God's calling. But that's a whole other topic in and of itself. But for this video and for this purpose right here, I don't know, I think it's very important to reflect on Abraham and to reflect also on the absurdity of what God calls him to do. Another great example of this is in the wedding feast at Cana, where they need wine and Jesus says, fill the jars with water. Like, that's absurd. We need wine. What are we doing with water? Here, Abraham is gonna be blessed through his generations through Isaac, and God says, go kill Isaac. That's absurd. So we must remember that God's ways are not our own, and there might even be some notion and idea of absurdity in the calling of God and what he calls us to do in our lives, and to be willing to accept that with faith, as that is what we are called to as Christians, to, yes, follow ethics. Yes, that is our baseline, but sanctity, holiness, the essence of that is aligning our will to God's, which may not always perfectly match up with ethics. God bless.